Huge deal. How are you feeling right now?
To be honest, there hasn't been a chance to think about it because it's been constant phone calls, emails, messages, interviews. So I don't think it's really sunk in. It's kind of surreal. It's great pride. This is an awesome thing in the sense that the first, not only Pope, but first American Pope from Chicago, and a relative.
Not a lot of people can say, my brother is the Pope.
That's correct. And I can now say it.
So when you found out, obviously you have pride, that's your brother.
Mm-hmm.
Did you...
There are moments in history when time seems to hold its breath, when an ordinary life, lived in the quiet shadows of faith and family, is suddenly lit by a light that reaches the corners of the world. For one man, seated at his kitchen table somewhere outside Chicago, that moment arrived without warning. A phone rang. Then another. Then his inbox flooded. Journalists, friends, old classmates, even distant cousins all reaching out with one question. Is it true? Is your brother really the new pope? And in that flood of noise, something inside him remained still. The gravity hadn't yet sunk in. There was no time to think, to pause, or even to breathe deeply. There were interviews to give, calls to return, and emotions that hadn't yet found words. But amid the chaos, one thing echoed in his heart like a steady bell: pride. Not the kind that boasts. Not the kind that stands on podiums. But the kind that wells up quietly in the chest when you see someone you love step into something sacred, something bigger than any one family, city, or nation. His brother, someone he'd shared meals and memories with, was now the shepherd of over 1 billion souls, and the world was watching. It's easy to imagine their childhood, two brothers running down narrow sidewalks in a Chicago neighborhood, sharing secrets, disagreements, perhaps even dreams. They were sons of immigrant heritage, raised in a place where hard work was not optional and faith was not decorative. Their home was modest, but the faith that lived in its walls was vast. Their mother's prayers, their father's sacrifices, all of it now converging in a moment no one could have predicted. And now, one of those boys stood at the center of a church that spanned continents. Not in search of power, but because he was called. Because the cardinal saw in him something rare: humility without hesitation, strength without pride, love without compromise. But what does it mean for a brother? For someone who remembers not the mitres or titles, but the birthdays, the laughter, the quiet confessions of doubt or hope. In the interview, he said it plainly. I don't think it's really sunk in. How could it? How does one begin to grasp the reality that the one you shared bunk beds and hand-me-down clothes with now wears the white robes of Peter? His voice didn't tremble with drama. It didn't reach for poetry. It was simple, unpolished, and true. It's kind of surreal, he said. And maybe that's the only honest word for such a moment. Surreal. Because who prepares for something like this? Who imagines that their family name will one day be whispered in Vatican halls? That their brother will appear on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica while the world holds its breath, waiting for the name of the next pope? And yet, here it is. Reality. History. Family. Faith. All colliding in a single name: Leo XIV. When asked how he felt, he didn't rush to spiritual language or political commentary. He simply spoke of pride. This is an awesome thing, he said. Not in the casual, throwaway sense of the word, but in the biblical sense. Awe, wonder, reverence, not just because his brother is now the Pope, but because, for the first time in history, the Pope comes from America, from Chicago, from their neighborhood, and more personally from their family. Not many can say that. My brother is the Pope. A sentence that feels almost too grand for daily conversation. But now it's his truth, and with it comes a silent awareness of what this means for him, for the church, for history. Because behind every great leader, behind every public figure, there are unseen roots. Stories, struggles, moments that never make the headlines. And this brother, perhaps more than anyone, holds those moments sacred. He remembers the long nights of study, the debates at the dinner table, the early signs that his brother was made of something different, not better, but deeply faithful, quietly devoted, called. He remembers the tears no one else saw, The doubts whispered only in private. The constant pull between serving God and navigating the weight of the world. And now, he watches his brother carry that cross more publicly than ever before. But even as the eyes of the world turn to Rome, there's something grounding in knowing that Pope Leo XIV is, first and foremost, a brother, a son. A man who once sat at a kitchen table just like this one, drinking coffee, listening to music, wondering about the future. His brother knows this. That's why, when asked about the moment, he doesn't dress it up. He just breathes it in. Slowly. Honestly. Like someone still trying to wake up from a dream that just might be real. And maybe that's the gift of this story. Not that an American became Pope, but that the divine can still be found in the familiar. That holiness can grow in the heart of an ordinary family. That somewhere in Chicago, a man sits answering calls, not because he sought attention, but because he loves his brother. And that love, more than any ceremony or title, reminds us that the church is built not only on theology and tradition, but on relationships, on sacrifice, on family. As the sun rises over St. Peter's Dome, and the name Leo XIV is etched into history, another sun rises over a quiet home back in the States where a brother still sits, answering questions, searching for words, and slowly beginning to realize, yes, it's true. My brother is the Pope.
Expect this?
To tell you the truth, no, because I kept hearing there will never be an American Pope just because the politics in the United States has too much world power now. They don't need also into the church. So I did not expect it. But when I heard he was in a group of 3, then I thought, well, this could happen.
When did you hear that part, and when did you know that he was maybe one of the finalists?
Maybe like a day or 2 after the Pope died, and they were talking about who are the runner-ups and who's in line next to be Pope. And I think I might have heard something about that at that point. Then I spoke to him Tuesday before he went into the conclave, and he just kept saying, no, that's not true, that's not true. So he's pushing it away, hoping that it would go away. It didn't go away.
When you actually heard that it was your brother who was selected, where were you? Were you watching television? Were you on the phone?
I was watching TV because I was reading a book. I got a text that said there's white smoke. So I went down and turned the TV on. No one knew at that point who the Pope was, but there was white smoke, so we knew. So I was watching. I called my niece just to make sure she knew. Then we just sat there and watched it. And then she said, look, the curtains are moving. I said, oh, something's coming up. Then that French bishop came out who was going to announce it, and we heard the name, and she screamed, and I said, oh my gosh, here we go. And then it has been nonstop phones and everything else.
The world will now call your brother Pope.
That's right.
You arguably know him better than most people. What kind of person is he?
A regular, run-of-the-mill person, I think because he was trained in missionary work in South America for so many years, he will be looking out for the disenfranchised. He will be looking out for the poor.
There are some things you prepare for in life: graduations, birthdays, maybe even retirement. But no one prepares to wake up and find out that their brother, once an altar boy in their local parish, has become the Pope. He said it himself, with the honesty only a brother can offer. To tell you the truth, no, I did not expect this. And who could blame him? For years, the unspoken rule had been repeated like a refrain in Vatican circles. There would never be an American Pope. The reasons always sounded logical enough: geopolitics, global influence, the delicate balance of power. The United States, after all, already commanded so much in worldly terms. Why would the Church, whose mission is to be universal, risk aligning itself with the world's most dominant superpower? But truth, as it often does, has a way of slipping past expectations. And grace, as it always does, refuses to be limited by human calculations. His brother heard the whispers. He read the commentary. He knew what they were saying. That an American could never wear the white. That it was impossible. And then suddenly it wasn't. He recalled the shift. A day or 2 after the previous Pope passed, the lists began to circulate. Names. Speculations. Patterns from the past. Who would be next? And in that mix, to his quiet surprise, his brother's name appeared. Not in the footnotes, but in the top 3. At that moment, the impossible began to crack open. But even then, the man who now wears the papal ring tried to push it away. In a call just before the conclave began, he tried to shut the door on the idea. "That's not true," he kept saying, again and again, almost as if repeating it would change the course of history, almost as if humility could shield him from a destiny quietly drawing closer. But destiny doesn't always ask permission. Sometimes it arrives gently, wrapped in incense and Latin, behind red curtains that flutter ever so slightly. He wasn't in St. Peter's Square. He wasn't in Rome. He was at home, with a book in his hands. The day had started like any other. Then, a text. "There's white smoke." Those 3 words stopped everything. He put the book down and turned on the television. No one knew who had been elected yet, but white smoke meant one thing. A decision had been made. A shepherd had been chosen. The world was about to meet its new pope. He called his niece. "Are you watching?" he asked. She was. Together, miles apart, and yet united by the same trembling hope, they stared at the screen. Waiting, watching the curtains, listening to the murmurs of the crowd thousands of miles away. And then it happened. A flicker in the red velvet. A movement behind the balcony. The anticipation was unbearable. And finally, the words rang out not in English, not in Spanish, but in Latin. "Annuntio vobis gaudium magnum, habemus papam." "We have a pope." When they heard the name, his niece screamed. He didn't. Not right away. Instead, he whispered something that only someone deeply overwhelmed by the weight of grace could say. "Oh my gosh, here we go." And from that moment on, life as he knew it was no longer ordinary. Non-stop. That's the word he used. Calls, emails, cameras, headlines. Because now, his brother is Pope Leo XIV. And the world isn't just curious. It's watching. It wants to know everything. What is he like? Who is this man who came not from Italy or France, but from Chicago, trained in South America, a missionary in the margins, a pastor before anything else? The answer comes simply, not rehearsed. He's a regular, a run-of-the-mill person. But there's something sacred about that statement. Because in the age of carefully crafted public images and curated holiness, to be described as regular is no insult. It is the greatest compliment. It means he never forgot where he came from. It means he's not a man who climbed a ladder, but a man who carried a cross. He knows what it's like to live among the forgotten. Years in South America shaped him, not in theory, but in practice, in sweat, in service, in silence. He didn't study poverty from afar. He walked beside it. He shared meals with the poor. He prayed in broken chapels. He listened more than he spoke. And now, that same man, the one who washed the feet of the homeless, who held the hands of the sick, who read scripture with the hungry, is the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church. It's no wonder his brother described him the way he did. There was no fanfare in his voice. Just a deep, knowing reverence. He will be looking out for the disenfranchised. He will be looking out for the poor. Because that's who he's always been. And maybe that's the deeper meaning behind this story. Not that a man became pope, but that the Church, once again, chose someone who understood that greatness lies not in grand declarations, but in quiet service. That authority means nothing without humility, and that to lead is to love first. So, while Rome rang with bells and the cameras turned to the balcony, somewhere in America, a brother sat in his living room, stunned, joyful, humbled. Watching it all unfold not as a spectator, but as someone who had lived the private life of the man now placed in public light. And in his witness, we find something beautiful. A reminder that the Church still surprises. That history is still being written. And that sometimes, when the curtains move and a name is announced, what we're really hearing is the sound of heaven touching earth through the heart of a brother, through the voice of a niece, through the call to serve not as kings, but as servants.
He will be looking out for those that don't have a voice. So I think he will follow in Pope Francis.
I was going to say, how is he different from Pope Francis? Or will he be different?
I don't know that you'll see a big difference. He met Pope Francis before he was Pope when he was in Argentina and my brother was in Peru. So that's how the connection began. I think they kind of believed in the same issues. So I don't know that there'll be much difference. He might prove me wrong, but I don't see there'll be much of a tradition breaking the tradition of Pope Francis.
You attending and being part of the church community that includes the south side of Chicago. How did that impact you guys?
See, he wasn't around a whole lot because after 8th grade graduation, he went immediately to the seminary. So he was in Holland, Michigan at the Augustinian Seminary for 4 years. And then he went into Villanova University, which is an Augustinian university. So he wasn't home a lot. Summer vacations, he was home. Growing up as kids, I think we were just regular kids and didn't really think about that kind of stuff. The interesting thing, I don't know how many people find it interesting, but when he was in 1st grade, a woman across the street that we used to play with the kids and a woman down the street said he would be the first American Pope. In 1st grade, they said that.
1st grade? A random woman told him he would be the Pope?
Well, they were neighbors. We knew them. But yes, he knew at that age he was going to be a priest.
In every great life, there are quiet moments that, in hindsight, seem to echo with prophecy. A passing remark, a childhood comment, a whisper from someone whose words at the time barely stirred the air, but years later, those same words feel like a thread pulled from eternity. For Pope Leo XIV, one of those moments came in the 1st grade. He was just a boy, then barely tall enough to look over a parish pew. He played in the streets like any other child, rode bikes, tossed baseballs, and ran across the same sidewalks his brother remembers so clearly. But then, something unusual happened. A woman from down the street, a neighbor, a mother, someone they all knew, looked at him and said something strange. Something almost laughable at the time. He will be the first American Pope. It was a sentence thrown into the wind of childhood. No one carved it into stone. No one wrote it down. And yet, decades later, that memory returned not as a prediction fulfilled, but as a mystery that had quietly followed him from his earliest days. But Pope Leo XIV wasn't raised in mysticism or grandeur. His roots were simple. His brother makes that clear. We were just regular kids. We didn't think about that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff like papal elections, theological debates, and global headlines were far from the minds of 2 boys growing up in the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago's South Side. Their world was small, but it was sacred in its own way. It was built on Sunday masses, family dinners, and the kind of faith that doesn't make noise but lasts. Then came a turning point. After 8th grade, while most boys were still learning who they were, he made a decision that changed everything. He left, not for fame, not for rebellion, but for formation. He entered the Augustinian Seminary in Holland, Michigan. 4 years of discipline, silence, and study followed, while the rest of his peers navigated adolescence. He was already navigating the call to serve something greater than himself. And from there, he moved on to Villanova University, continuing his journey of formation with quiet intensity. His brother remembers it well. He wasn't around a whole lot, he says, not with sadness, but with understanding. Summer vacations became rare. Childhood routines faded. But something deeper was growing beneath the surface. A vocation not just to priesthood, but to a life poured out entirely for others. That life would eventually take him far from Chicago. To Peru. To missionary work. To the margins. And it was there, amid the struggles of the poor and forgotten, that another quiet thread was woven: his first meeting with a fellow servant named Jorge Mario Bergoglio. At the time, Bergoglio was in Argentina. The future Pope Francis. 2 men. 2 nations. 1 shared heartbeat. They weren't strategizing for power. They weren't building careers. They were simply tending to the spiritual wounds of the world, listening to those who had been silenced, and offering hope where systems had failed. That's where their bond began. Years later, when asked how Pope Leo XIV might differ from Pope Francis, his brother answers carefully. I don't know that you'll see a big difference. It's not a political statement. It's not a critique. It's recognition. Because both men came from the peripheries. Both knew the smell of sheep, as Francis once said. Both believed that the church is not meant to be a fortress, but a field hospital. That the gospel is not a slogan, it's a way of life. And that leadership is not defined by status, but by how low one is willing to bend to wash another's feet. He will be looking out for those that don't have a voice, his brother says. That one sentence so simple, so unassuming, is a blueprint for the papacy ahead. Because in an age drowning in noise, the true test of a leader is whether he listens to those no one else will hear. And Pope Leo XIV has been listening for a long time. Long before the world knew his name, he was walking the unpaved roads of forgotten towns, preaching not with microphones, but with meals and mercy. He spoke less, observed more, and carried the burdens of others in silence. He didn't seek to be different from Pope Francis. He sought to be faithful to Christ. And now, seated on the chair of Peter, he brings with him the same quiet fire that once led him to the seminary as a boy. It's easy to talk about tradition and change, about reform and resistance. But perhaps the deeper question is this: what kind of heart does this man bring into the Vatican? His brother answers without hesitation. A regular one. Not crafted in marble, not detached from the world, but shaped by the dust of the poor, the cry of the lonely, and the laughter of siblings who once chased each other down city blocks. That's the real story. Not just a man who became pope, but a life that was always quietly preparing for this moment. Through formation, through sacrifice, through every yes whispered in silence. He is not the pope of spectacle. He is not a media creation. He is a missionary with calloused hands and a heart trained in compassion. And now, as the world leans in to see what kind of pope he will be, his brother offers us a glimpse that no cardinal or commentator could provide. He's someone who doesn't forget the voiceless, who doesn't seek the spotlight, who once, in the first grade, was unknowingly named by a neighbor as someone destined for the highest office in the church, not because he wanted it, but because he was ready, formed not in the luxury of privilege, but in the obedience of love. And that, more than any policy or prediction, may be the greatest reason to hope. Long before the name Leo XIV was etched into the legacy of the papacy, before the white smoke rose, before the cameras turned, before the world paused, there were two boys growing up on the south side of Chicago. Their lives were like those of thousands of children in the city, marked by cracked sidewalks, corner stores, the toll of church bells, and the kind of faith passed down quietly at kitchen tables. Their home wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. What it had was structure, respect, and most importantly, presence. A mother who prayed with purpose. A father who believed in work done well. And a home that was warm even when the winters weren't. The Pope's brother, now flooded by interviews and requests, remembers those early years, not as sacred legends, but as honest memories. "We were just regular kids," he said, "and it's in that ordinariness that something extraordinary was born." They shared bedrooms and breakfasts, outgrew bikes and baseball gloves, and sometimes argued over chores like any siblings do. But even then, there was something in his brother, a quiet that wasn't just shyness, a kindness that didn't need applause. He wasn't the loudest at the table. He didn't chase the spotlight. But he listened. Carefully. He noticed things. People. Needs. Silences. And when others laughed and played, he would sometimes be found reading, reflecting, or just still. And then came that strange comment, one that only seems remarkable now in retrospect. A neighbor woman, standing on the front porch across the street, looked at the young boy in first grade and said something that would echo for the rest of their lives. "He'll be the first American pope." Nobody paid it much attention. Why would they? In a neighborhood like theirs, futures were imagined with humble limits. Policeman, teacher, maybe a priest. But pope, that was a world away. A word reserved for Rome, not Chicago. But seeds are funny things. They don't bloom when they're spoken of. They bloom in silence, under the soil of years and choices. By the end of 8th grade, while his classmates were deciding which high school to attend, he had already made a decision that startled even some of the adults. He was entering the seminary. Just like that, he stepped out of the world most boys his age were still learning to navigate. He entered formation at the Augustinian Seminary in Holland, Michigan. 4 years. 4 formative years spent not in rebellion or confusion, but in seeking the face of God in discipline, in prayer, in surrender. He wasn't home much after that. Summer breaks became brief visits. Holidays came and went, sometimes with just a phone call. And while some siblings grow apart over time, distance only deepened the reverence between them. Because every time he came home, he wasn't just older. He was different, calmer, more centered. Like someone who had already chosen a road and was quietly walking it, step by step, without needing anyone to notice. From Michigan, he went on to Villanova. Another chapter. Another layer of refinement. Theology. Philosophy. The studies that stretch a mind, but more importantly, shape a soul. And yet, beneath the growing intellect, the advanced degrees, the worldliness that comes with higher learning, he remained simple. Grounded. Still the same boy who held open doors without being asked. Still the same brother who would rather listen than speak. His brother remembers those transitions. How odd it felt, even then, to realize that while most of them were building careers or chasing dreams or still figuring things out, he was already pouring his life out. Not for success, but for service. And eventually, that service took him far from Chicago to places most Americans will never see. To remote towns in Peru. Villages in South America where faith isn't a luxury, it's a lifeline. Where hunger doesn't come just from food, but from hope. Where Mass is celebrated not in marble cathedrals, but in dusty chapels with broken pews and full hearts. It was there that he began to see the church not as a structure, but as a mission. In Peru, he lived simply. He learned languages. He shared meals with the poor. He prayed with farmers. He listened to the forgotten. And it was in those years unseen by the world, uncelebrated by news, that the heart of a pope was quietly formed. He met then Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio during those years, while Francis was still serving in Argentina. Their connection wasn't political. It wasn't strategic. It was pastoral, mutual. They were men formed by the same spiritual soil: Ignatian spirituality, Latin American poverty, and a fire for the gospel that doesn't settle for comfort. Years would pass. Appointments would come. Responsibilities would rise. But his brother watched all of it unfold with a kind of awe. Because none of it changed him. Not really. He still called. He still asked about the family. He still remembered birthdays and prayed for the sick and wrote letters by hand. In fact, he often disappeared from public view, not out of secrecy, but out of preference. He believed that real change didn't come from noise. It came from nearness. And now, as the world comes to know him as Pope Leo XIV, his brother remembers a time before any of this was possible, when the name wasn't yet global, when the title didn't exist, when it was just the two of them, walking to church on Sundays, standing next to each other in wooden pews, heads bowed in prayer. And even though the Vatican now echoes with his brother's voice, and the title Holy Father follows him wherever he goes, to the man giving this interview, he is still simply his brother. That's what makes this moment so impossible to fully grasp. Because while the world sees history being made, he sees the long road that led here. The boyhood, the sacrifices, the discipline, the silence, and the overwhelming love of a man who never wanted to be important, only faithful. And somehow, in God's design, that was enough. There are doors that, once opened, never close again. For the young man who had already given up his teenage summers to study theology and worn the robes of a seminarian while his peers were still chasing degrees and paychecks, that moment came quietly, without trumpets, without grandeur. Ordination. Not the end of a journey, but the beginning of something far more hidden. The vows were made. The oil was poured. And from that moment, his life no longer belonged to him. The man who would become Pope Leo XIV entered priesthood not with ambition, but with a bowed head. He didn't rush to large cities or crave the influence of high-ranking appointments. Instead, he was sent to places most would overlook: forgotten towns in Peru, mission territories where the only wealth was the dignity of the poor and the flickering hope of the gospel. His brother, now watching the world repeat his name across headlines, remembers how little they heard from him during those early priestly years. There were no Instagram updates, no blog posts or press releases, just handwritten letters that came sporadically, simple pages filled with stories of children who had never seen a doctor, of elderly women who walked miles for Mass, of moments when faith became bread in the hands of the people. He baptized babies wrapped in old shawls, heard confessions in broken Spanish and Quechua, and buried the dead with no family in attendance but the sky. His churches weren't made of stone, they were made of tin and prayer, held together more by faith than by nails. And still, he never asked to leave. Not once. Because in those years, something deeper began to form in him, not just a priestly identity, but a posture of heart. He wasn't just preaching Christ. He was becoming Christ for others. In patience, in presence, in the painful, unglamorous constancy of showing up, even when no one noticed. And in that hiddenness, something remarkable happened. The church began to notice, not because he sought visibility, but because he radiated something different, an authenticity that couldn't be staged, a spiritual strength that didn't depend on charisma, but on quiet fidelity. He was called back from the mountains one day, not because he asked, but because someone higher up had heard the same thing from multiple sources. This man listens. This man loves. This man leads without needing to lead. So he was summoned to assist with seminary formation, first in Latin America, then abroad. At first, he resisted. Not out of fear, but because he believed his home was with the people he had served for so long. But obedience was a virtue he had long ago learned to trust. And so he returned reluctantly but faithfully. His assignments grew. First as a formator, then as a provincial leader, then as someone tapped for more delicate missions on behalf of the church. He learned to navigate more than poverty. Now he was navigating systems, bureaucracy, the intricate dance of church governance. But even then, he never lost his footing. He never wore ambition like armor. He walked softly through halls where others ran. And when he spoke, even powerful men paused, not because of volume, but because of gravity. His brother remembers watching from a distance, still grounded in their Chicago roots. He never changed, he said. Even when he got the titles, the responsibility, he never needed the attention. And that may be why he kept rising. Not like a man climbing a ladder, but like water rising quietly in a well. Slowly, steadily. Until one day, the world could no longer ignore it. He was appointed bishop, then archbishop, then called to Rome itself, not to rule, but to serve in one of the most overlooked offices of the Vatican, overseeing the lives and vocations of religious orders around the globe. It was the kind of position that required wisdom, delicacy, and unwavering loyalty to the heart of the church. He handled scandals with silence and compassion. He met victims not with policy, but with presence. He reformed where needed, resisted where necessary, and above all he listened. And all the while, he kept returning to the basics. Daily Mass, hours of prayer, letters to family, long walks at dusk through the quiet gardens of the Vatican, where he would speak only to God and carry the names of those he served in his heart. When Pope Francis noticed him, it wasn't out of novelty. It was recognition. These two men, one from Argentina, the other from America, had walked the same spiritual terrain. They had both learned the language of the poor. And when the time came, it was Francis who gave him more responsibility, not as a reward, but as a burden to carry. But not once did he suggest that he was next in line. His brother remembers the phone call days before the conclave began. The media was already whispering about his chances. Pundits had put him among the top 3 names. "Is it true?" his brother asked. The answer came swiftly, almost defensively. "No, that's not true. It's not going to happen." But even then, something in his voice hinted at a deeper knowing, not ambition, but surrender. He had long since stopped trying to control the path. All he could do was walk it with open hands. And now the path has led here. Rome, the Vatican, the throne of Peter. The burdens of 1 billion souls now laid across the shoulders of a man who once heard a neighbor in first grade say, "He'll be Pope one day," and never gave it a second thought. His brother, sitting in a quiet living room thousands of miles away, watches it all with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Because to the world, this man is now a head of state, a spiritual father, a historical figure. But to him, he's still the boy who played in the alleyways, the young man who wrote letters home in careful script, the brother who said no to everything the world offered so that he could say yes to the one thing that mattered. And that is how the papacy of Leo XIV began. Not with ambition, not with campaigns, but with a life hidden in service, stretched by silence, and elevated not by the hands of men, but by the mysterious and gentle will of God. The world doesn't often stop moving, not for wars, not for speeches, not even for tragedies. But yesterday, for a few fleeting moments, it did. The square was full. Tens of thousands of eyes turned toward a balcony framed in velvet and shadow. Above them, the chiming bells of St. Peter's rang in slow, solemn rhythm. Journalists scrambled to translate Latin. Phones trembled in hands. Children sat on shoulders. Pilgrims cried without knowing why. And then the name was spoken. Leo Quartus Decimus. Leo XIV. A name that had not graced history books. A name few had predicted. A name not born in Rome, nor Lisbon, nor Buenos Aires, but in the heart of Chicago, to a family that never asked for greatness and never expected to be written into papal history. And when he stepped forward, when the white robes caught the light and the crowd collectively drew breath, it wasn't charisma that held them. It wasn't ceremony. It was stillness. He stood there, just for a moment, as if the weight of centuries had settled on his shoulders in that precise second. Not just the weight of the office, but the invisible thread that ties him to every pope who has come before. To Peter. To the martyrs. To the saints and sinners who built and broke and rebuilt the church again. The cameras zoomed in on his face. There was no political grin. No performative wave. Just a man who had always preferred silence, now standing before a crowd that spanned the globe. And then he spoke. Softly at first, as if speaking from a place deeper than voice. Fratres et sorores, buona sera. Brothers and sisters, good evening. A simple greeting. A mirror, perhaps, of the one Pope Francis had offered when he first appeared on that same balcony. But the tone was unmistakably his own, measured, gentle, quietly firm. Not a performance, but a beginning. He did not speak long. He never has. Those who know him say he weighs his words the way a craftsman weighs precious stone. But in those few minutes, he said what needed to be said. He did not begin with policy. He did not launch into vision statements. He did not deliver the grand address of a man eager to lead. Instead, he did something far more telling. He asked for prayer. Not for the church. Not for the world. But for himself. Before I offer you my blessing, I ask you please pray for me. And for the second time that day, the world held its breath. Tens of thousands of people bowed their heads. The square fell into silence, real silence, not just quiet. Even those watching through screens and phones thousands of miles away felt it. The air changed. The noise of history paused. The new pope had made his first move not by commanding, but by kneeling in spirit before the people. It was a moment no camera could fully capture, because that is the paradox of this man. He is now the most visible figure in the church, and yet he remains, somehow, hidden. His brother said it best. He's regular. But there's nothing regular about what happened yesterday. There's nothing ordinary about seeing the face of someone you grew up with projected on screens across 5 continents. About hearing his name in multiple languages. About watching him offer a blessing that now echoes through cathedrals and cottages, prisons and hospitals, dorm rooms and war zones. And yet, it was precisely that grounded ordinariness that made the moment holy. He didn't stand above the crowd. He stood with them. The world has changed since the last conclave. There is more division, more distrust, more exhaustion in the hearts of believers who wonder whether the church still sees them, still understands their pain, still offers something deeper than doctrine. And in one evening, Leo XIV did not try to solve those problems. He didn't promise transformation overnight. He didn't rally applause or provoke headlines. He simply stood and let the quiet speak. What came after was a flurry of reactions. In Rome, people wept openly. In Latin America, priests who had once served beside him fell to their knees. In Chicago, his home parish rang its bells long into the night. In seminaries, young men stared at the screen in wonder, realizing that the path they had chosen had just been walked step by someone who had once sat where they now sit. Even the critics struggled to find footing. Because how do you argue with humility? How do you attack a man who has already surrendered everything? His first day as Pope wasn't filled with grand gestures. He rose earlier than anyone expected. He visited the chapel alone. He did not summon advisors. He did not stage a photo. Instead, he prayed for over an hour in silence, the same way he had done every morning for decades. He ate breakfast modestly, greeted the household staff with the same warmth he would show to bishops, and declined a formal motorcade to his next meeting. "I'll walk," he said. The cameras tried to keep up. The headlines stumbled to capture something real. But what they kept returning to, what the images kept showing, was a man who walked slowly, as if still listening to something no microphone could pick up. And behind every one of his steps, a quiet question emerged in the hearts of the faithful. Could this be the Pope we've been praying for? Not a savior, not a celebrity, but a shepherd. One who knows the weight of suffering, the cost of discipleship, the ache of unanswered questions. The Vatican, usually abuzz with formality, seemed to exhale, as if even the marble itself recognized that something different had begun. This was not a man who would seek to impress. This was a man who would seek to understand. His brother, still fielding phone calls and blinking at the sheer scope of it all, smiled when asked what came next. "I don't know," he said. "But I know he'll take care of the ones no one else sees. That's what matters now. Not what policies will be issued. Not what traditions will be emphasized. But whether the voice that rose above the square yesterday, gentle, hesitant, true, will continue to speak for the voiceless, for the invisible, for those who have waited so long to be seen. And if yesterday is any sign of the days to come, the answer may not come with fire or thunder. It may come in the form of a man in white, walking quietly through the heart of the church, listening. And from that listening, healing. The square eventually emptied. The bells stopped ringing. The lights on the cameras dimmed. The headlines, so urgent only hours before, were filed, published, and moved on to the next breaking story. And for the first time since the white smoke rose, the Vatican returned to quiet. But inside, beneath the centuries-old frescoes and echoing halls, something sacred was still unfolding. The world had seen his first steps. They had heard his voice. But now came the moment that would never be televised. The first night. The first silence. The first breath as the newly chosen vicar of Christ taken alone, behind a closed door. They call it the Room of Tears. It's a small space, tucked away beside the Sistine Chapel, where the newly elected Pope is led immediately after the announcement. The name isn't symbolic, it's real. For centuries, it's been the place where joy and terror collide, where the overwhelming truth of what has just happened becomes unavoidable. That's where Leo XIV sat last night, not yet fully dressed in papal white, staring at a simple crucifix that hangs in the room. He did not cry at first. He simply looked. He looked at the Christ who had been crucified. He looked at the symbols of authority being prepared for him. The white cassock, the shoes, the ring. A tailor was waiting quietly nearby. So was a master of ceremonies. They had done this before. But the man before them was not rushing. He stood only when he was ready. And when he did, he whispered a prayer, not aloud, but under his breath. No one asked what he said. But those present noticed that his hands trembled not from fear, but from reverence. Later that evening, long after the crowd had cheered his name, he was shown to his new temporary residence. Not the apostolic palace. Not yet. That comes later. For now, he would spend his first night in the Domus Sancti Marthi, the modest Vatican guest house that has become the home of popes before moving into formal papal quarters. When asked if he would like the larger suite, the answer was immediate. No. A small room is fine. Old habits die hard. And his were formed in the mission fields of Peru, where his bed was often a cot, and his chapel was often made of wood and wind. His first meal as Pope was taken in near silence. A simple plate of vegetables, a cup of warm tea. He sat not at the head of the room, but somewhere in the middle, surrounded by familiar faces now seeing him in a light that felt almost too bright to look at directly. He didn't speak much. Not out of coldness, but because the day had already spoken volumes. When someone congratulated him, he simply smiled and said, "Pray for me. I'm still learning to carry it." Later that night, he slipped away from the noise of congratulations and protocol. He returned to the chapel. Alone. No aides. No photographers. No press releases. Just a man in white, sitting in the presence of the one who had led him here. He didn't kneel right away. He sat in the pew, hands folded, eyes closed, and for a long time he didn't move. Some say he remained there for nearly 2 hours, praying, listening, perhaps even grieving the quiet death of the life he had just left behind. Because make no mistake, when a man becomes pope, something dies. Not his faith, not his joy, but the freedom to live unseen. He now belonged to the church. Every word weighed, every gesture studied, every silence interpreted. And still, there he sat. Not grasping for power, not adjusting to fame, but simply adjusting to obedience once again, as he had always done. When he rose from the pew, it was nearly midnight. The chapel doors closed softly behind him, and he returned to his room. There was no entourage, just the quiet creak of old wood and the faint sound of his steps down the hall. In that room, away from the grandeur of the basilica, he took off the white cassock for the first time, folded it himself, hung it gently over a chair. Then he reached for something older than all the ceremony, a worn rosary he had carried since his days in the missions. The beads were smooth from use, the crucifix slightly bent, but it was his. He prayed it by the window, overlooking the Vatican gardens. No script, no pageantry, just whispered Hail Marys and the soft breath of Rome stirring the trees below. By morning, the world would call him Your Holiness. But in that room, he was simply Jorge Mario Prevost again. A man with trembling hands and a willing heart. The next day began before dawn. He rose early, as he always had. Before anyone knocked, he was already dressed in plain clothes and had returned to the chapel for morning prayer. Not because it was required, but because it was his anchor. When the aides arrived, they found him deep in contemplation, his breviary open, his lips silently forming words that only heaven would hear. Breakfast came shortly after, still simple. A bowl of fruit, some bread, a note left beside his tea, a letter from his brother. No official Vatican seal, just handwriting familiar, warm, honest. He read it slowly, smiled, and placed it inside his missal. Later that morning, he met with the cardinal electors. Not in a grand hall, but in a modest reception room. He greeted each one personally. No titles, just names, just eyes meeting eyes. Some embraced him, some knelt, some wept. He thanked them not for choosing him, but for trusting the Spirit. When one asked how he felt, he answered honestly. Like Peter stepping onto the water, unsure, but willing. And that was enough. Outside, the world speculated. Analysts debated. Journalists filed new angles. But inside the walls of the Vatican, the man who had become Pope was not strategizing. He was still praying, because his first full day had never been about planning for power. It had been about surrender, about laying down even the last pieces of the life he once knew and stepping fully, finally, into the life that had been waiting for him all along. The weight of the white cassock does not come only from its history. It comes from its expectation. And now, as the Church wakes to a new dawn under Pope Leo XIV, questions quietly begin to rise, not with urgency, but with a kind of watchful wonder. What will his papacy look like? Where will he lead us? What path will the Church walk under his care? No declarations have been made. No sweeping reforms announced. And yet, there is already a quiet shift in the atmosphere, not dramatic, but palpable. Because the man now seated in the chair of Peter has never been driven by pressure. he is not a man of spectacle. His movements are deliberate, his decisions rooted in prayer long before they ever reach the public eye. Those who have served alongside him over the years say one thing with certainty. He listens deeply, speaks sparingly, and acts only when he believes the time is right. Which raises the question now unfolding in parishes, monasteries, chancelleries, and kitchen tables across the world: what time does he believe it is? If past is prologue, then one might expect a papacy centered not on institutions, but on persons. On the margins. On the wounds that are often hidden from the spotlight. He has long been shaped by missionary work, not just in geography, but in philosophy. He believes the church must go out, must bend low, must become again what Christ called it to be. A home for the broken, a voice for the unheard, a mirror of the gospel not just in word, but in presence. For many, that vision sounds less like a strategy and more like a return. Not a revolution, but a restoration not of structures or politics, but of something older, deeper, and far more demanding: holiness. There is talk already of whether he will continue the pastoral priorities of his predecessor, Pope Francis. The early signs suggest alignment. Both were formed in Latin America. Both were molded by poverty and proximity to suffering. Both have rejected clericalism in favor of humility. It would not be surprising to see Leo XIV strengthen the Church's commitment to the poor, to the migrant, to those excluded not just economically but spiritually. But there may also be subtle differences in tone. Where Pope Francis often spoke with fire direct, urgent, challenging, Leo XIV may speak more like stone warmed by sun. Steady, patient, consistent. His leadership could emerge not from confrontation, but from constancy. A quiet revolution that unfolds in the silence of faithful witness, rather than the noise of institutional overhaul. One question that will certainly emerge in the coming months is how he will approach the deep tensions within the global church. East and West. North and South. Traditional and progressive. The fracture lines are visible. They have been for years. And yet, this pope, formed in the tension between continents, cultures, and communities, may be uniquely equipped to stand in the middle, not as a referee, but as a bridge. He is not a man who speaks only to one side. He is a man who walks with both and listens to all. His appointments, his priorities, his language, all of this remains to be seen. But if his past is any guide, we can expect a papacy that reaches across divides not to blur them, but to draw people together under the banner of something greater than opinion: Christ. There is also the question of reform, curial reform, doctrinal clarity, liturgical emphasis. Will he reshape the Vatican departments? Will he elevate new voices from underrepresented regions? Will he emphasize silence, beauty, and reverence in the liturgy, as his writings have hinted? No one can yet say. But what is already being noticed just hours after his election is the absence of performance. No choreographed slogans. No political undertones. Just presence. A pope who begins not with a vision statement, but with a pause. A request for prayer. A moment of stillness before the machinery begins to move. And in that stillness, the faithful listen. Young Catholics, especially, are watching closely. In an age of noise, they are drawn to authenticity. They are not asking for perfection, but for truth. They are not looking for grand gestures, but for someone who walks with them. Someone who acknowledges the complexity of the modern world without abandoning the simplicity of the gospel. Leo XIV may be that someone. Already, his election has stirred unexpected hope in places the church has long struggled to reach. In secular cities. On university campuses. Among disillusioned youth who had stopped listening until now. Not because he dazzled them, but because he didn't try to. It is too early, of course, to predict what will come. No pope walks alone. The pressures of geopolitics, media narratives, and internal resistance weigh heavily on any pontificate. But if the first hours of his leadership are any indication, Pope Leo XIV will not be rushed by headlines or defined by agendas. He will move on his knees before he moves on paper. He will consult not only advisors but the Word of God. And his greatest decisions may come not from strategy rooms, but from silent chapels. Some speculate that he may make his first public trip not to a political capital or a cathedral, but to a refugee camp or a remote mission or a hospice. Not to impress, but to affirm, to remind the world where the Church truly begins. Others wonder if his first encyclical will reflect the themes he has preached for decades: mercy, reconciliation, and the rediscovery of contemplative life in a world drowning in distraction. No one knows for sure, but there is a feeling spoken in whispers around the Vatican, and louder in homes across the world, that something gentle but strong has entered the stage. Not a storm, but a steady rain. The kind that softens hard ground. The kind that takes time, but brings life. He is not the Pope of the moment. He may be the Pope of the long road, and perhaps that's what the Church needs now: not a firework, but a flame. Not a warrior, but a healer. A man whose strength lies not in dominance, but in depth. He has not promised to fix everything. He has not claimed to be the answer. But in his eyes, quiet, clear, unwavering, there is something unmistakable: a willingness to serve. Not for applause, not for legacy, but because he believes that Christ is still the answer, and the Church still the bridge. That is the promise of Leo XIV, not in his words alone, but in the silence between them. The world did not sleep the night Pope Leo XIV was chosen. Across time zones and languages, screens lit up bedrooms and chapels, newspapers printed in haste, and the image of a calm, unassuming man standing on the Vatican balcony began to circulate with quiet force. It wasn't just another pope. It wasn't just another chapter. For many, something about him, his stillness, his restraint, his unmistakable sincerity, suggested that a shift had begun. And slowly, across continents, the Church began to respond. In Africa, the news reached rural villages long before the headlines were translated. In dioceses where power grids are unstable and internet comes in bursts, priests gathered the faithful beneath trees and corrugated roofs to announce the new Holy Father. Some had never heard his name before, but they heard how he had lived, how he had served in the missions, how he had walked beside the poor, how he had listened more than he spoke. That was enough. An elderly bishop in Kenya, who had met him briefly at a synod years ago, told his seminarians, "He remembered my name, not because I was important, but because I mattered to him." In Asia, where the Church often walks a tightrope between visibility and survival, the election stirred cautious hope. Underground communities celebrated in whispers, lighting candles in honor of the new successor of Peter. In cities like Manila, Mumbai, and Hanoi, parish bells rang, not with political glee, but with spiritual recognition. One homilist simply said, "We do not yet know what he will do, but we recognize the heart that beats behind those eyes." In Latin America, the reaction was more personal. For those who had seen him preach in village churches, who had seen him offer Mass on cracked wooden altars, who had sat with him during pastoral visits and heard his soft Spanish in confessionals, he was not a distant figure elevated by strangers. He was one of them. A brother. A shepherd who knew the scent of dust, of poverty, of incense rising in a room with no roof. A young priest in Peru wept during a live-streamed Mass as he told his congregation, "He taught me to kneel before the Eucharist when no one was looking. Now the whole world looks at him, and he is still kneeling." In Europe, especially in places where faith has faded into tradition, something unexpected occurred. Young adults, many long detached from the Church, shared clips of his first appearance. Not because he said anything new, but because he didn't try to be anything but real. On college campuses in Germany and France, professors and students discussed him not as an institution, but as a presence. "He's not selling us something," one student said. "He's just being." And in the United States, his homeland, the response was layered. For older Catholics, especially immigrant communities in places like Boston, Chicago, and New York, his election felt like a miracle they never expected to see. Not because of nationalism, but because of history. For decades, they had heard the same refrain: an American pope would never happen. It was too political, too complicated, too risky. And yet, here he was, from the same sidewalks, the same parish pews, the same shared past. And suddenly, the old women who had prayed rosaries for decades felt seen. The retired priests who had quietly wondered if Rome had forgotten them felt remembered. But perhaps most notably, it was the disillusioned, the restless Catholics, the spiritual but not religious, the ones who had left quietly years ago, who paused. Not to return. Not yet. But to notice. To feel something in his gaze that wasn't trying to pull them back, but was simply holding the door open. Not demanding faith, but inviting reflection. He hadn't spoken to the politics. He hadn't flattered the headlines. He hadn't shouted to be heard. He had simply asked for prayer. And somehow that disarmed the defenses many didn't realize they still carried. Inside the Vatican, preparations were already underway for his first public address, one that the world would surely dissect. Advisors assembled drafts. Curial leaders made introductions. Diplomatic channels opened. But amidst it all, the new pope remained as he had been, silent, watching, listening, moving slowly, as if not wanting to disturb the grace still settling in the room. Those closest to him say he carries a notebook in his pocket, not for appointments, but for names. Names of people he meets. A sick child. A grieving widow. A seminarian unsure of his vocation. He writes them down, one by one, so he can pray for them later. It's a habit he's kept for decades. No one taught it to him. He simply began one day and never stopped. Now, those names are joined by nations. By responsibilities that stretch further than any man can truly hold alone. But he does not seem afraid, because he's never believed that holiness means having all the answers. For him, it has always meant standing in the space between questions, and trusting that Christ will be enough. There are expectations forming around him already, that he will address the divisions in the church, that he will guide the synodal path, that he will clarify doctrine, restore reverence, defend tradition, protect the poor, respond to crisis, and chart a way forward in a rapidly changing world. But he has not rushed to meet any of them, not because he doesn't care, but because he knows what too few remember. The church is not saved by declarations. It is saved by saints, and saints are not made in conferences. They are made in the silence of prayer, in the shadow of